2 Kings chapter 4 is where we pick up, looking at Elisha, is how I pronounce it. Pronounce it however you want. We didn't live during that time. We don't know exactly how to say it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But Elisha is how I'm going to pronounce it. But we find in chapter 4 of 2 Kings, there's a lot of things that's going to take place. It's really going to set up for what happens towards the end of chapter 4. Looking at God giving life to a boy. But we back up all the way to what I call Elisha and the poor widow, as you have there in your notes. Elisha became, now some of what I'm going to tell you this evening will not be on your outline, so don't be alarmed if you don't see it. But Elisha became the leader of the prophetic schools in Israel about the year 848 BC. He lived into the reign of Jehoash, who came to the throne of Israel in 798 BC. And so for half a century, Elisha led the sons of the prophets. During those years, the idol Baal was finally defeated in the northern kingdom. You remember the occasion with one of the greatest occasions is when the conquest or the contest, but with Baal and the prophets of Baal, the former prophets of Baal, and they go to the Mount of Carmel and they set up an altar, and they cry out to their God, for all this time, and then nothing happens, and then the prophet of God calls out, and what happens? It consumes the altar, and so that really fits in what we're talking about here, how the time of Baal's, or at least in this area, was really defeated and at least very much minimalized during this time period because of men like Elisha. Now, Elisha's ministry was really, you might say, undergirded by a large number and wide variety of miracles. Somebody say that there was a lot of miracles that involved Elisha. And I meant to make a copy of this map, and I will probably during our break. But I have a map here, and it shows, you can't see it from where you're sitting, but it shows all the different places that Elisha was, and it shows all the different miracles that he did in those locations. I'll make a copy of it during our break. I just slipped my mind to do it. But he shows all the different places in which he performed miracles, of course, by the power of God. And so a lot of his reign, a lot of his ministry included miracles, which is very unique because some prophets, they didn't have maybe as many miracles, or maybe some didn't have any miracles at all, which they performed. Maybe they were just proclaimers of the word. But Elisha had many miracles that took place while he was out doing the work of God. Now here in 2 Kings 4, you have here in your notes, in 2 Kings 4, verses 1 and 2, you have what we call the widow's crisis. Now, they're in the midst of a great famine, which means they're struggling for food, they're struggling for water. And isn't it interesting that, especially in the Old Testament, that it's during times of struggle and heartache that the power of God really shines through. It's like last night we talked about Gideon and the Midianites, and how the Midianites were oppressing God's people, and how they were threshing out wheat in a winepress and things like that. But as you read on, you see that God's power shines through, and they are delivered, and of course things begin to turn around. And that's what we're going to find here, is that God, during these difficult times, is going to once again show His power to the widow, and also, of course, through Elisha as well. And so we begin by looking at 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. It says, "A certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, saying, Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord, and the creditor is coming to take my 2 sons to be his slaves." Now, there are several things that are worth noticing here. First of all, it says here in verse 1 that this is a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets. That kind of tells you a little bit who it is. And then he goes on to say here, she cried out to Elisha and says, your servant, my husband. So her husband was one of Elisha's servants. She goes on to say, is dead. Now notice, and you know that your servant, her husband, feared the Lord. Now that's another way of saying was obedient to the Lord. Many times in the Old Testament, the idea or the phrase fear the Lord shows a sign of obedience and trust and faith in God. And that's the same idea we find here. So her husband, she reminds Elisha, you know that your servant feared the Lord. Your servant obeyed the Lord. And so that is something that is to no doubt be commended, to say the very least. But also we continue reading there in verse 1. And the creditor is coming to take my 2 sons to be his slaves. Now, aren't you thankful that today, if we get in a bind and we owe people money, that they'll never come and take our children to be slaves? You know, that is unimaginable. Now, slaves doesn't always mean slaves when we think about sometimes in our mind because of history and the way things have been skewed sometimes. We think slaves, we think like the slaves we know from American history and things like that. But sometimes these individuals are simply just employed. They took them and they brought them in and they made them work and labor until they worked off whatever debt they had. In fact, we know in the New Testament you have the term bondservant that's used. And it's not like a slave we would talk about today that we would think about as being employees. In fact, the bondservant had certain rights. The owner and the master, you might say, is what's used there. They're not owner, but master. Had certain obligations to his servants, and the servants had obligations to their master. And so it wasn't what we think about so many times today when we hear the word slave. It was more they're going in, they're working off their debt. And you notice, of course, you know, if they're working off their debt, the last thing you really want to do is have them die, because then they can't work off their debt. They're not going to help you any. And so they're actually going to provide and take care of these sons so they can work it off. But the problem is they're being taken away, and they're going to be taken away from this woman to work for possibly years upon years to pay off this debt. And so that's the situation or the crisis that she finds herself in verse 1. Her husband's dead. That tells us, it sounds like if her husband's dead, maybe he was sometimes we say he was the one who's making the income. Sometimes we use the term breadwinner. But now he has died, and what happens? Somebody has to pay the debt. And so the creditor comes, and he's going to take her 2 sons to basically work for him until the debt is paid off. But the crisis is, it's not like they get to come home every night. They're taken away. And they're going to be in his house working until he says that they have fulfilled, whatever debt. And so that's the crisis she finds herself in. Now notice in verse 2, you'll find several times throughout chapter 4 that he uses the phrase and asks the question, what shall I do for you? And so he asked the question in verse 2, what shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house? And she said, your maidservant has nothing in the house but a jar of oil. Now, if someone was to tell us that today, we'd think, well, all I have in the house is a half gallon of milk. That's kind of how I compare it. I do some cooking when I don't burn stuff, and oil is rarely used. It's most of the time something else, milk or whatever else. And so here, she says, all I have is a jar of oil. Now, when I read verses 2 and following, and if you know much about what's going to happen, it reminds me a whole lot of when in the New Testament, Christ takes a little of the few fish and the loaves of bread and feeds thousands and thousands and thousands of people. We have something similar here, I think on a smaller scale, at least, because it wasn't going to feed thousands, but it's going to pay off a debt. Now, it's always interesting, and maybe it's interesting to us. We think it's maybe a little odd because we think, well, how can someone pay off their debt with oil? Well, keep in mind, first of all, they're in the middle of a famine. If we were in a famine today and you had milk that you could use the others could buy from you instead of for $3.50 a gallon because it's a famine. They're willing to pay you $20 a gallon for some milk. You can pay off some debt pretty quick. And so they're in the midst of a famine, and so oil, this cooking oil obviously, is going to help them tremendously. But it's not just the single jar that's going to pay off her debt. Now we know as we keep reading here, we're going to find in verses 3 through 7, we find Elisha's command. Verse 3 says, "And he said, Go, borrow vessels from everywhere, from all your neighbors, empty vessels. Do not gather just a few." So go gather empty vessels. Now you start to wonder, what is she going to do? You know, maybe put yourself in her shoes. What is she thinking? What am I going to do? I have one jar of oil. I'm going to go gather all these other jars. For what? There's only one jar of oil. But he tells her here, verse 3, do not gather just a few. Now, back in the 50s, I've seen from movies, wasn't alive in the 50s obviously, but used to see in movies sometimes, kids during that area, they would pull a buggy behind them with glass bottles and things that they would recycle, and they'd fill that thing up and then they'd go recycle them all at one time. Well, imagine her kind of doing a similar thing. She's not recycling though, but here she is giving up all these vessels that she can, not just a few, which means get all that you can. And so she's going to go gather up all these empty vessels. And being in a famine, there probably were plenty of empty vessels to go and get. Verse 4, "And when you have come in, you shall shut the door behind you, you and your sons. Then pour it into all those vessels and set aside the full ones." Now notice in verse 4, it's only her and her two sons who are going to actually witness the filling and filling and filling and filling and filling of jars and vessels. No one else is going to be in the room. It's just these three individuals. He says, "When you have come in, you shall shut the door behind you and your sons, then pour it into all those vessels." Now, common sense says you can't pour one jar of oil in all the vessels. They're not going to fill up. You put maybe a little bit in each one, depending on how many you have, maybe a drop. So how are you going to fill it up? Well, of course, this is where the power of God comes in, doesn't it? And so in verse 4, "When you have come in, shut the door behind you and your sons, then pour it into all the vessels and set aside the full ones." And so it's just going to be an assembly line. Just turn the jar up and just keep filling them up and just keep going. Just keep setting them aside as you fill them up. "So she went from him and shut the door behind her and her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured it out. Now it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said to her son, 'Bring me another vessel.' And he said to her, 'There is not another vessel.' So the oil ceased," which means it stopped replenishing or stopped producing. Verse 7, "Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, 'Go sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons live on the rest.'" Now, could you imagine having empty gallon jugs and taking 1 gallon of milk and you're filling up all these jugs and you just keep on going? Well, in the midst of a famine, in the midst of maybe some type of outbreak, which is a very real possibility. Maybe you have E. coli or some kind of disease infects a lot of cows, and all of a sudden the milk that hasn't been contaminated, well, that's worth a lot more now. Well, you could sell that at a premium. Well, that's what is happening here. Oil was something that not everybody had. They're in the midst of a famine, and so she is able to pay off her debt there in verse 7. "Go and sell the oil and pay your debt." That, to me, it's not just that she had something that no one else had. It's that she had a lot of it that no one else had. So much so in verse 7, "Go and sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons live on the rest." Live on the rest. Meaning what? Use it to cook, whatever, and that's going to keep you going until times improve. And so this is one of the first examples of God's power here in 2 Kings chapter 4. Now, the reason we bring this up because this sets the stage for what's going to happen later with Elisha. It's not just one miracle that's going to happen. There's several things that are going to take place. Now, we also notice that Elisha and a certain woman, a Shunammite woman, however you want to pronounce that, she takes a special notice of Elisha. You notice in 2 Kings 4 and verse 8, and it happened one day that Elisha went to Shunem, where there was a notable woman, and she persuaded him to eat some food. So it was, as often as he passed by, he would turn in there to eat some food. And so here is this notable woman, which means people probably knew of her. They knew who she was, maybe because, well, think about it for a moment. One of the reasons you become known by others is maybe by your personality and things that you do. Well, here she is offering to feed Elisha whenever he comes by. Well, that's showing hospitality and kindness, and so it's no doubt, no reason, no surprise, rather, why she is a notable woman. There was a notable woman, and she persuaded him to eat some food, which means he didn't just say, yeah, sure, I'll take it right away. She had to persuade him. She had to kind of talk to him and talk him into it to do it. She persuaded him to eat some food, so it was as often as he passed by, whenever he came through that area, he would turn in there to eat some food. She took care of him because, as we know in verse 9, we'll see in a moment, she says, look now, I know that this is a holy man of God who passes by us regularly. And so for that reason, she didn't feed him just once, but she kept on doing so. We think about, gospel meetings and lectureships and things. Many times speakers will stay in someone's home because it's not fun to stay in a hotel and we don't know anybody and go back to the hotel. What are you going to do? You're going to sit there. Well, if you're able to stay in someone's home, you get to know them better. You get actually a home-cooked meal. You don't have to eat fast food or whatever every night. And you get to know people better and you enjoy hospitality. Well, that's what she's enjoying with Elisha. And who better to have, fellowship and show hospitality to than a servant of God? And obviously we know he was one who was worthy to have hospitality shown to him because he was a servant of God. Now, verse 9 says, and she said to her husband, look now, I know that this is a holy man of God who passes by us regularly. And so he comes by enough that it is considered to be on a regular basis. He's traveling from different places, and he's stopping in, and she's providing food for him. Which, of course, you remember back in Bible times, providing food wasn't just like going in and putting something in the oven. It was a process. It took time to do those types of things. But it just shows her hospitality and her love for this man because he's a servant of God. Verse 10 says, please let us make... Now notice this. I don't think you probably hear about this kind of stuff today. But we have those today who whenever someone passes through, we say, hey, just stay with us. But we usually don't add on to our homes for them. Because in verse 10, that's basically what she's going to do. She says in verse 10, please let us make a small upper room on the wall, and let us put a bed for him there, and a table and a chair and a lampstand, so it will be whenever he comes to us, he can turn in there. Now that is hospitality. That is kindness. That's also sacrifice because, during the time period in which they're in, no doubt things were food was hard to come by, but also any other things would have been difficult to do beyond that because you're spending most of your means on food and to provide for yourselves. But she's providing for Elisha, her and her husband, I should say. And now it's beyond that. They're going to make him a small upper room on the wall. Now, can you imagine, you used to come in someone's house and, you have a meal with them. You realize, that's just part of your stop or your visit. And one day you come by and they have added on a special room to the house for you for whenever you come by. Well, that would change things in a positive way. They were kind before, but that is just, what we say, is above and beyond anything you could imagine. And no doubt took expense, took time, took effort, but that's what they did. Verse 11 says here, and it happened one day that he came there and he turned into the upper room and lay down there. And then he said to Gehazi, his servant, call this Shunammite woman. When he had called her, she stood before him, and he said to him, that is to his servant, say now to her, look, you have been concerned for us with all this care. What can I do for you? Now, he is a prophet. He is a man of God. God has given him the ability to do different miracles, work miracles. God's going to work miracles through him, I should say, as you've already seen with the oil. And so when a man of God says, you've been kind to me, you've been good to me, you've taken good care of me, what can I do for you? You know, what do you say? Well, we see we go on and read there in verse 13, he says, you want me to speak on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army? He's willing to speak to them, which means basically if I go and talk with them, it's a guarantee of aid or help in some way. You go and talk to the king. He could have went and talked to the king and perhaps arranged to have food brought to their house every week. You know, anything could have been possible. When we go talk to the commander of the army, you know, maybe you think you need some protection, some defense. Let me go talk to the commander of the army. We'll take care of that. Because you have been good to me, you have cared for me. Verse 13 says, she answered, I dwell among my own people. Which means she doesn't want him to go talk to the king or talk to the commander of the army. She actually doesn't make a request at all. Now verse 14 says, so he said, what then is to be done for her? And so he's obviously speaking to his servant because his servant's going to answer. So he's saying, what can we do for her? And Gehazi answered, actually she has no son, and her husband is old. Now, what a unique thing to do. You think, what can we do for him? And his mind says, you know, she doesn't have any kids. Her husband's old. Let's give her a son. Today we think, you know, that's impossible to do, obviously. But for Elisha, okay. Why? Because, well, God is with him. And because she has cared for him, and not just one time or several times, but for an extended period of time, gone above and beyond, showing her dedication to this servant of God because he's a servant of God. And so, verse 15, so he said, call her. When he had called her, she stood in the doorway. You know, isn't that interesting? She stood in the doorway. She didn't go into that little upper room. It's interesting that it seems, when I read that, I read about the upper room being built and the food being taken. She wanted to take care of him, but also not be intrusive. You know, sometimes when if you go to a gospel meeting somewhere and you're asked to stay at someone's house, it's nice and enjoyable, but sometimes it comes time to study, it's like hard to find time to study because everybody's talking and visiting, and it's hard to say, I need to go review my lesson for tonight. Well, here she stops at the doorway. She doesn't go in. She's not being intrusive, but she's still providing for him. But she stops at the doorway there in verse 15. Then he said, about this time next year you shall embrace a son. And she said, no, my Lord, man of God, do not lie to your maidservant. Don't lie. You know, why? Because her husband is old. Which obviously, you know, if her husband is old, then it seems like they're beyond child, you know, bearing years to be able to have a child. That's why his servant said, look, she doesn't have a son, her husband is old, let's do this because otherwise it wouldn't be possible. But she responds here in kind of a similar way, like some commentators say, it's kind of similar to what Sarah did when she laughed at God. But she doesn't laugh. She just says, look, don't lie to me. You're a man of God. Don't lie to me. It's not, you know, why? Because she doesn't have a son. They're older in age. It shouldn't be possible. Verse 17, but the woman conceived and bore a son when the appointed time had come of which Elisha had told her. Now, did Elisha lie to her? No, he did not. Now, as we know from the text, if you keep reading, which we'll talk about after our break, that she comes back and makes this statement again because this son does die. But Elisha keeps his word because we know what's going to happen, being from the text and things. But he basically, because he is a man of God, with God's approval, grants her the ability to have a son a year from the time he had told her that. And a year later, verse 17, the woman conceived and bore a son when the appointed time had come, of which Elisha had told her. And so we have seen several, at least a few examples of God's power here already in chapter 4. First, with the oil being reproducing, paying off a debt for a widow. Now, this woman who has taken care of Elisha doesn't have a son. Because she has done so much for him, God gives him the ability to grant, to say that you're going to have a son a year from now. Verse 16, about this time next year you shall embrace a son. And that is granted to her by the power of God. And so we have two occasions there already. Now we're going to stop there. And we're going to come back after our break. And we're going to pick up with verse 18. And verse 18 is going to, and following is going to get right into our main text. And God giving life to a son, to a boy rather. And so we're going to stop there. We're going to take our break.